Today we're going to talk about genre and the literacy narrative. So to understand the genre of the literacy narrative, it's going to be helpful to first understand something about genre. So, very messy concept, and full disclosure, I did my dissertation on it, so I probably see it as messier than most, but it's messy. So we're going to try to clear that up a little bit. So there's a lot of different ways we can view genre. One way, probably the most common way, is as a category. This is probably the meaning of genre you're using when someone says to you, "Hey, what genre of music do you listen to?" And you're like, "I like heavy metal," or "I like R&B." You're thinking of it as a category you can classify things into. Another common way, and this is a very common way, especially with fiction right now, is the subject matter. So, is it about vaguely medieval stuff? Then it must be fantasy. Is it about space stuff? Then it must be sci-fi. So, subject matter. And in this case, the literacy narrative is very much a genre of subject matter in that it's defined by being about literacy. You can also see it as a sum of conventions. Historically, a lot of genre researchers have seen it this way. Where they have tried to categorize just lists of conventions. So the Gothic novel has to have a heroine who does this, and a hero who does that, and a villain that does this. Things, it has to have supernatural things. A sum of conventions. So you can think of it that way too. Or you might think of it as something that's very dynamic. Genre is something that changes with each time we use it. So every time you make a superhero movie, yes, it's like all the superhero movies that came before it, and identifiably so, but at the same time, it makes its own impression on the genre and expands what a superhero movie can be. Genre is also its function. What is it used for? What does it do? That's a very pragmatic way of looking at it. And then genre can be, this is the most common definition in rhetoric and composition, is genre is social action. And this was defined by Carolyn Miller. And Carolyn Miller says that genre is a typified response to a recurring social situation. So we can see this when we look at genres like the best man speech at a wedding reception, where people expect this person who is close to the groom to make a statement in order to solemnize the wedding. We see this in State of the Union addresses. We see this in just the genre of apologies. And then there's another definition that's similar to function, which is use value, which is what is the thing seen as being useful for. For instance, consider a desk. How is a desk different from a table? And most of that is in how it's used. Now, something that is designed to be a desk might be designed slightly differently than something designed to be a table, but mostly we identify it by how is it used, how is it positioned in the room. Another common view of genre is as a social contract. So in this view, genre is a set of expectations by the audience and a set of expectations by the author. And as long as those expectations are met, everyone comes away going, yeah, that's what that genre was. Which leads me to my definition, which is that genre is ludic. That is, it's a game. So in my definition, it's partly social contract, but the ludic dimension makes it so that, when you're playing a game, you have different rules in that game for how you interact than you do outside of that game for how you interact. If you're playing a game with your friends, it's perfectly okay to try to stop them from doing the thing they want to do. That's what makes it fun. But if you do that in real life, that's not so great. And so what I'm suggesting is that in a genre, within that genre, the rules are different than within other spaces socially. So for now, let's think of genre as one of two things. Let's think of it as a set of conventions that is repeated in order to address a similar situation. So this mixes social action, the convention lists, and a few other genre definitions together. And you can also think of it as a tacit game, that is, we don't talk about it necessarily, that we enter into with a goal and an agreed upon set of rules for what excellence will look like. So, we might not all have exactly the same idea of what, say, a fantasy movie should look like. We all kind of agree on mostly what it should look like. We can agree when we see a good one. But keep in mind, and this is super important, we don't just be good writers in general. Even the best writer is not just a good writer in general, but rather a master of particular genres. So I might be really good at writing, say, novels, but really terrible at writing sonnets. I might be really good at writing letters, but really terrible at resumes. So think about it in terms of mastering a genre. Also, since we're doing literacy narratives, I need to kind of nip this one in the bud because it happens every time. Literacy is not literature. Literacy is not literature. Literacy is however you want to define it based on last week's readings, but it has to do with being able to encode and decode symbols. It has to do with your ability to read and write, or whatever the equivalent is in that situation, to understand meaning making in that situation. Literature is artistic writing, so novels and plays and poetry, or you can think of it as written material, which will be a definition that will come back later in the semester when we talk about literature reviews. But they're not at all the same concept. They have the same root word because their root words have to do with writing, but literacy is not literature. So in order to do this genre of the literacy narrative, we need to think of the literacy narrative as a personal story. It is often multimodal. It can be just straight up written, but especially given that I've told you for this assignment I don't want it to be, many examples you'll find will be videos or spoken word poetry or any number of multimodal genres. It is defined by a specific subject, that is literacy, and it is autoethnographic, which is a kind of research common in the humanities, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So if it's a game, what are the rules of the game? An excellent literacy narrative will be very personal, so we should feel like we know you. It'll be concrete and specific. Don't be abstract. Don't talk in generalizations. Talk about this specific day, that specific moment. It should be brief and concise. It should be illustrative. It should work like a case study. And when you read case studies, they have a lot of details. They have a lot of focus on the specifics. And so in order to make it like that case study, focus on your characters, your context, and your situation. And how is it research? We talked about this. It's autoethnography, which means we're using ourselves and our own communities and our own experiences as the subject of study. And we are valuing the individual experience as an example, or possibly even as an exception to larger, more empirical types of research. And we are contributing to the larger body of research by providing more case studies and evidence that researchers can use. We're also developing and applying concepts. We're entering into the conversation that way. We are making a claim about what literacy is or looks like or is for, and we're diversifying the research with many voices. We are entering the chorus. You don't make yourself heard by shouting over people. You make yourself heard by joining the choir. And so by adding your unique voice, we are enhancing the overall composition of what we know about literacy. So be brief, be specific, focus on literacy, not literature. Keep your audience in mind, and apply what you're learning in class.